All right. All right. So tonight we continue our study in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. Chapter 11. We'll get into it after our open prayer. So let's give him glory and let's pray. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you this night for we've all gathered before you, desiring to learn from you the deep things, the secret things, my Lord, of your scriptures. So Lord, as our hearts are open, our minds are open, our souls are ready to receive, pour into us all those things, my Lord, that only you can give unto us, that we may understand as you understand and see what you see, my Lord, when it comes to our life and the lives of others. But Lord, I thank you for every word you're about to speak. It is such a blessing to our lives, to our very souls. It's refreshing. And if anyone should be on their way, traveling mercies upon them, I pray they log on, that they may not miss a word of what you're about to speak, my Lord. For this night, my Lord, you have much to say and much to teach us. And I thank you as your people grow, as they become closer to you, more intimate with you, as they become enlightened by your word. I pray you'll fulfill all things, our Lord, that you have promised, because tonight it is about to get close. So thank you, my Lord, for every word. Put your words upon my lips. I am your servant. Pour yourself out. Speak liberally and freely, my Lord. Have your way this night with us in Jesus' mighty name. Amen. All right. We are continuing our study in Hebrews chapter 11. But before we get started, just a recap of what we went through. Now, we already talked about the foundation of faith, right? We're talking about the foundation. This is where he's going with chapter 11. By faith, we understand about the substance and the evidence, right? And so the substance being the foundation of our faith. In the process, he shows the examples of people who had faith, who lived according to their relationship with God. Abel, Noah, right? And Enoch. Then he goes into faithful Abraham. When he starts to talk about Abraham, he takes us down a different way, because Abraham lived by what he believed, just like the others, but he lived by what he believed, who God was to him. So he was willing to obey no matter what God had asked of him, like leave his family, go to a foreign land. God was going to guide him. God made promises to him because he did those things. And then in the end, we got about the heavenly hope where Abraham was looking at the promise that was made to him. What was ahead of him? He could see it within his own soul because God put it in him. He saw it and God made the promise of it. And so we come into this place where we're in verse 17, where we talk about the faith of the patriarchs. We're only talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're not going to get into anybody else. Our study tonight is only going to be from 17 to 22 because there was so much in it that I said I didn't want to mix it up, because right after that we go into the faith of Moses and I didn't want to mix the two up. So tonight is verse 17 to 22. Let me read the whole thing through and then we can get into a few things, right? 17 to 22, chapter 11 of Hebrews, and it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. Let's stop. I'm going to get into only this because Paul is continuing his epistle by focusing on Abraham. He's focusing on Abraham. That's why I didn't want to take it away by going into Moses. I want us to focus on Abraham and his line, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and also Joseph. But when you take a look at what he says in the beginning of verse 17, now you got to remember, when we talked in the last study, faith is a foundation. That's why it's a substance. It is the foundation of everything we build in our relationship with God. Everything we believe goes into that foundation so we can stand on it. What we believe goes there. What we see goes there. What we understand goes into this, making the foundation, which is our faith, substantial to how we walk and how we live with God. And so everything we believe is in that foundation that we stand on, and we don't waver from it. In the beginning of verse 17, he says, for by faith, Abraham, meaning for Abraham is who the Jews, and he's using Abraham because the Jews considered Abraham as the founder or the father of Judaism. He was the beginning. For Abraham taught his children. He taught his children, Abraham, Isaac, right, and Jacob, because they were all alive at the same time at one time, right? For Abraham taught his children that there was only one God. Abraham taught his children that there was only one God. And his children, by the promises of God, was Isaac and all who came after him. That was the promise to his children. The promise being from God for all his descendants was Isaac and anyone who came, like I said, anyone who came after Isaac. He is the father or the beginning of the Jewish nation because the promises started with him. God didn't make promises to anybody else. It started with Abraham. It started with Abraham for the children. There is no one else promises are made about children, but to Abraham, it started there. That's why he's considered the father of Judaism, because the promises started with him. That was the beginning of their nation, right? Their nation. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested. Now, when you look at the tested, when he was tested, put a D there. This is in reference to Genesis 21, 1-14, when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, okay? This is his time of testing. God confirming Abraham's faith through requesting that he sacrifice his son Isaac as a confirmation of his love for God and his acceptance of God as God. Remember, he taught his children there is only one God. So now here God is testing his foundation, his faith, okay? And by that foundation, or by that faith, God was able to ask him, right, for his son. This is his testing. So the testing wasn't only something that, let's see if you can do it. It was something that God was confirming. It was a test of confirmation. It wasn't a test of, or a trial of, can you do this or not? It was actually a confirmation that the promise that God made to Abraham could be fulfilled, because if he fell away from trusting in God, right, because now he has a son, and if he fell away from trusting in God because because a lot of people think that once they receive the blessing or receive something from God, that it's over. It's not. Because once you receive something from God, because you remember the son Isaac, once he received Isaac, the promise wasn't over. The promise was to continue. It was to continue. Was Abraham still going to be faithful to God so God could continue this promise? This is what he was being tested, to confirm that Abraham would move forward, that Abraham would continue. A lot of people, when we receive blessings from God, we think that that's it, the fulfillment. And that's it. So we don't continue because we receive what we're looking for. No. Once you receive something from God, it's about continuing now. You have to, because it helps build something in you with God. And so it never ends. So when God has blessed you, like many of you, God has already blessed you, you think it's over. You think because God gave you that thing or blessed you with that thing that it's done? No, that thing he gave you was to build something with him. And that thing which he's trying to build is going to get tested because he gave you that. Understand that? That was part of his promise to you. So that's going to be tested. And this is his testing. God confirming Abraham's faith, or Abraham's stand between him and God, right? Acceptance of God as God, right? He accepted God as God. And to confirm his love for God greater than his love for his son. And you don't have to go there, but in James, I'll just tell you, in James chapter 2, just this one, verse 21, he says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac, his son, on the altar? See how he was justified? This is what God was doing in confirming Abraham's faith. He was justifying Abraham worthy of the promise, worthy of that promise. So Abraham's justification was not that he did what God asked. Now you got to listen to this. It's not that Abraham did what God asked, but that he put God above all. You understand that? Because when God asks the harder things, sometimes we don't put God above those things that he asks for. What we do is we weigh the pros and cons, but in putting God above or making God God, you're justifying yourself and God justifying you that he is God in your life. A lot of times we don't put God above those things, and we struggle with those things that God is asking for, that God is desiring of us, from us, through us, right? But God asked Abraham this because he was justifying Abraham. He knew the whole thing. Honestly, the whole thing is God knew Abraham's heart. God knew Abraham's heart. God knew what he could ask Abraham. He knew he could ask this of Abraham, but did Abraham know he could do it? See, God knows us better than we know ourselves, right? And even though God was above all things in Abraham's life, and he loved Abraham and he loved God above everything, God did tell him, right? God did tell him in Genesis, in verse 20, in chapter 22, he said this one. And then he said to Abraham, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. You see that? Because God says, I can see you love your son. And your love for me is great, but your love for your son is great. Am I still above in your heart? Am I still God in your heart? Because I gave you the promised son. Yeah. Does it still continue? Am I still more? It's kind of like that. So when God asked for it, this is what God did. Speaking in James, justification. It was justification. When Abraham, our father, he was justified by his works when he offered Isaac, his son, on the altar, because the work by offering Isaac showed how much faith or how much trust he had in God. How much trust he had in God. How many of us would fail that test, right? To show that we trust God above all things, right? So God asked that he put him above all things. And by putting God above all things, by that, the act and the willingness to give up Isaac as a sacrifice, right, to the one true God, justified him as faithful. Did you hear what I just said? By that act, that willingness to sacrifice Isaac, the willingness to give up Isaac for God to always be God, right? As a sacrifice to the one true God, God always going to be one, God always going to be above all. It justified him as faithful. It justified him as faithful. When you look at Genesis, going back to Genesis, a couple of verses, I'm going to be referring to 22 because it's all based on that one. 22, verse 11 and 12. That's why in verse 11 and 12, he says, when Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son, he was willing to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. You see that? That you have not held your son, your only son, the one I gave you, the only one you have, right? The one of his old age. You did not hold it back, right? You did not hold it back. You have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. You see how justified Abraham was? That he put God above his son, his only son, the one God gave him, the one that the promises was going to come through. He didn't hold it back, because even if God made the promise, even if God said it would come to Isaac, fulfilled through Isaac, no matter what, God was still going to be God. God was still, rather God use Isaac or not, God was still going to be God. And in his willingness to sacrifice Isaac, or to put Isaac in that place, his testing was justified. God justifying it, right? Saying that his faithfulness, now I know you're faithful, that you didn't, because you don't hold anything back. You understand that? You don't hold anything back from me. You have not held back your son, your only son, from me. Now, how faithful are we? How much do we hold back from God? But we say we try to be faithful, but we're holding back our Isaacs. Because we think that's all we have. That's not faith. And your faith can never be justified if you hold back your life from God, right? You hold back your life from God. So that was the true test. That was the true test. That Abraham stood on his truth about God. Remember the foundation? Well, he believed God was number one. God is over his whole life. That was part of his foundation. That's what made his foundation. God is God. He stood on God being God. It's the truth in him about God. That his faith, his foundation proved itself to be true and without hypocrisy. It was true. His faith was true. All that his faith was built on, all that he believed was in that foundation, and it proved itself to be true because he did not hold Isaac back. He was willing to offer up Isaac. That's why that's the test, right? Isn't that the test? When he was tested, and our faith is always being tested because we profess great things, don't we? And we say great things about God and what God can do. Yet when God puts those things to the test, because those words are supposed to be coming from this foundation that you stand on, not words just that's floating around your head because that's the thing to say, that's the thing to do. No, you speak from here. You speak from what you speak from where you stand. You don't speak from the flightiness of your own understanding, because when you do that, God's going to test it to see if that is part of this truth. And a lot of us, that flighty thought is not part of this, and we cannot stand because it's not part of the truth. It's not part of the foundation. Your foundation is being tested. Everything you speak and you believe is in it. And when you say things about God, it better be in there too, because he's going to test it. So you better stand on it. You know what I mean? You better stand. Anyway, so that is his faith, his foundation. It proved itself by his willingness to slay Isaac, because God asked it, and it made his foundation, his faith true before God and there was no hypocrisy, no doubt. Yeah, no doubt. That's why when he was tested, offered up Isaac, right? When he was tested, offered up Isaac. You see the finality of what that says? When he was tested, offered up Isaac. It doesn't say when he was tested, he was going to offer up Isaac. No, offered up Isaac. It's so final. I read this and I said, wow, that's just a statement. Offered up Isaac. Abraham was willing to give the thing that he loved most. Like he says, like God says, offer up your son. Yeah. Your only son, whom you love, right? Your only son, Isaac, whom you love. That's what God is saying, whom you love. And offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, I shall tell you. Whom you love. God knew how much Abraham loved Isaac. He did. He did. He knew how much Abraham, because he was the son of promise, right? Abraham was willing to give the thing that he loved the most, his son. Yeah, God recognizing. Now look at this. God is recognizing Abraham's love for Isaac because he can see it. He can see Abraham's love for his son. He can see it. He's in love with that boy, man, Isaac. Yeah, Abraham's love for Isaac. Ask for the thing that could hinder God's promises. It could. Promises from being fulfilled. Isaac, because he loved Isaac so much, it could have hindered God's promises to become fulfilled. Because when God makes a promise, it's about who God is, not who you will become. It's about what God wants done, not what you think you're going to be, right? So if God is saying that he's making a promise to Abraham, yeah, that in your descendants, you'll be like the sands on the sea, the stars, look into the stars, and if you can count them, your descendants shall be, right? All of this going to happen will come through your son. Okay. If that is the case, right? God seeing his love for Abraham could pull him away from God. It could over time. And how many have said they love God, but yet the things of the world have pulled you away, even a little bit. It's pulled you away from God. And when it pulled you away from God, God reckons it can hinder God's promises for you. It can, because something is becoming greater than him in your life, right? And so the promises of God can only be fulfilled to those who have faith in God. The way God determines, yeah, the way God tests you. You cannot just assume God can give you whatever you want and you're unfaithful. You understand? You cannot. It's the same thing with Abraham. God was testing him, right? Testing him. But yet he offered up Isaac. When he was tested, offered up Isaac. That's what his test. Offered up Isaac. He did it. He put his son on that altar. He raised his hand with his knife. He was willing to slay his son. He offered up Isaac. It goes into more of that. We're going to get to it as soon as I get to the bottom half of this verse. For if he loved Isaac more than God, yeah, Isaac would become the reason for God not fulfilling his promises to Abraham. But Isaac is the reason God was going to fulfill that promise. Yeah. Isaac wasn't supposed to be a hindrance. He was supposed to be the reason for the blessing, for the promise, for the promises, for the promised one, Isaac, cannot become greater. The promises itself cannot become greater than the God who gave it. It cannot. God had this issue with the Pharisees, right? Because they made the goat of the temple greater than the God of the goat. And they made the sacrifices and the things of the temple greater than the God of the temple. That's why God had issues with the Pharisees, because everything was greater than God, because their eyes were on the worldly things. For God, Isaac, or just the promises itself, cannot be greater than the God who gives it, who gives us those promises. You understand that? God gives the promises, and that is what we stand on, not the promise itself. You understand? Not the promise itself. So God asking for Isaac and Abraham willing to sacrifice Isaac, right? Proved Abraham's complete trust in God. His foundation of who God is and what he has with God was justified by God. It was justified by God when God stopped Abraham from sacrificing Isaac. Because Abraham was willing to go all the way, offered up Isaac. That's why there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Offered up Isaac. That statement says he was willing. He gave himself completely to do the will of God. No hesitation, none whatsoever. So God justified Abraham, right? Abraham, by stopping him from sacrificing Isaac. By stopping him from sacrificing Isaac. Yeah. In this, God was saying to all that, as Abraham believed God, God also believed in Abraham. That's what his justification did. God was saying, Abraham, I believe you. Abraham was saying, I'm sacrificing Isaac because God, I believe you. God stopping Abraham was God telling Abraham, I believe you. As Abraham loved God, God also was loving Abraham. So in Abraham sacrificing Isaac, Abraham was telling God, I love you more. In God stopping Abraham from sacrificing Isaac, God was telling Abraham, I love you above all. Get it? Can God say that about some of us? I know, right? And as Abraham would do and give anything to God, even his only son, God would do the same for Abraham. That's why God made such a grand promise. He was going to give Abraham everything because Abraham was giving God everything. You get that? For Abraham knew God so intimately that nothing would stop him from being God's good and faithful servant. Nothing would stop him from being obedient to God. Nothing, not even his promised son. Not even his promised son. He goes on to say, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. So it wasn't the promises that moved Abraham. It wasn't the promises that moved Abraham to do God's will. Because God made a promise. Okay, God made you a promise. Now we got to do these things. No, the promises didn't move Abraham. Abraham was being moved before the promises came. Remember? Get out of your family's house. Get out of your family's land, right? It wasn't the promise that moved Abraham to do God's will. But who God was to him, who God was to Abraham, moved him to do his will, no matter what God asked for. No matter what. Who God was to Abraham is why Abraham moved the way that he did. And because God was everything to Abraham, he was willing to sacrifice his son. He was willing to give his son because that's who God was. Even to sacrifice Isaac as proof or evidence of this truth, that God was God and God can ask for anything. And I've said that before. He can. When you trust him, yeah, God's going to ask and you can't hold anything back, you know. Verse 18. Of whom it says, in Isaac, your seed shall be called. Now, this is spoken in Genesis 21:12. This is before he asked for Isaac. Yeah, this is before he asked for Isaac, before asking for Isaac. And though God was talking about the bloodline that brought forth the tribe of Israel, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob becomes Israel, right? Yeah, the tribe of Israel. It is also a shadow of what was to come for all of God's people. Because in Romans chapter 9, I'll read it. Oops. In Romans chapter 9, from verse 9, where it talks about Israel's rejection and God's justice. From verse 9, it says, oops, up here. For this is the word of promise. This is the word of promise. At this time I will come and Sarah shall have a son. And not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one man, even by our father Isaac. For the children not yet being born, nor having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to the election might stand, not of works, but of him who calls. You understand this? So what God was saying, whom he has said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Because what God was saying here, concluding, right? Oh, going back. What God was saying here, like in Romans 8, that it was all for God's purpose. God had a plan because it was for his purpose. And he used Abraham as a vessel to bring forth the purpose of God. And for God to bring forth his purpose through our lives, we got to be just as faithful so God can fulfill it. If we are not faithful to the God, what makes us think that we're fulfilling the will of God? Because in our mind, we tell us we're doing God's will. Look how you hold your life back. Look how you hold your things back. Look how you hold yourself back. Look what you do. Look how you struggle with having a relationship with God. It's showing you're not giving yourself to God. You know what I mean? In fact, you're hindering yourself because you're not letting go of Isaac. Isaac is, instead of Isaac becoming the promise, Isaac's becoming a hindrance because you can't sacrifice Isaac, right? You can't sacrifice Isaac. And so if Abraham couldn't do it, I mean, God would have taken Isaac, right? God would have taken Isaac. In this, God is saying, like in Romans, in Romans, like he's saying, for the children not yet being born and nor having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to the election might stand. Because God chose Abraham out of everyone. He chose Abraham over everyone, that his purpose, because he elected Abraham, might come to fruition, might stand, might continue, that the promises might continue, right? But not by the works, but by him who calls, by God who called, by him who called, right? The children, for his purpose. His call, right? His call being Abraham come, right? Calling Abraham to do his will, right? God chose him to bring forth the promise. Now, even though he made the promise to Abraham, it was for his purpose. Remember, within all of the promises, in the end, his son was going to come forth to deliver all of mankind. Because why? Because they were kicked out of the garden from the beginning. There was no way for mankind to come back to God. This was part of the plan. And because God needed it to be fulfilled, he found his faithful. He called his faithful. Abraham was faithful in all his ways, to the point of willingness to sacrifice Isaac, to prove that. So in Abraham, because God had that purpose, right? And God saying, in whom he said, in Isaac, your seed shall be called, meaning his people, his elected people, which was going to come through his son, Jesus Christ, right? His son, Jesus Christ. It's a shadow. It's a shadow of what was to come for God's people, which was his son. In 19, he goes, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. Now let's stop for a second, even from the dead. Now this is Abraham, this is Paul talking about what Abraham is thinking. Yeah. Abraham came to the conclusion. In other words, he thought about it, right? He thought about it. Concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. In this, you see Abraham, he put thought into what God had asked. Now, if God asked you to sacrifice your son, what did you stop and goes, holy shit? And really goes, he's asking for Isaac? And then it's going to make you look. It's going to make you look at how much you trust God and what you believe. It is. It's going to. This is what it did to Abraham. Concluding means that he put thought, yeah? Yet he did not consult anybody else. He didn't go tell his wife, God is asking for Isaac. He didn't go talk to his friends. No, he looked within himself. He consulted with God. He talked. He spoke out loud, right? He spoke to God. And he consulted with only himself, yeah? He did not consult with anyone to help him decide what to do it, if he should or shouldn't. His reasoning was the reasoning that comes from faith. And I'm talking about this conclusion. When God asks, this is that concluding. When God asks of you, no matter what it is, do you stop and weigh the pros and the cons? Do you look into your life? Do you debate? Do you get afraid? Do you start looking at your lack? Do you start looking at your sickness? Do you start looking? You see what I'm doing? Because what we do is we start to weigh the pros and cons. Abraham came to a conclusion because of his faith. He knew what he stood on when he came to God. And all he did was pull on all of that that was already there. God is God. And God can ask for anything, right? It's all a part of that. All part of that. because he reasoned by faith, not what from the outside, but from what was inside of him, what he stood on. And so what did he do? He stood, he goes, well, God is God. God can have whatever he asks for. So he comes to a conclusion. God is going to have Isaac. You see that? God is going to have Isaac. This is his conclusion. His conclusion was not that he believed that God would. See, he didn't stand, he goes, God can do anything, and God can raise my son. Let's stop for a second. He didn't come to the conclusion that God was, that not that he believed that God would raise his son from the dead, but that God was able to do anything, even raise his son. He didn't come to that conclusion because he said, well, if God is asking for Isaac and Isaac is the son of promise, then I guess I'm going to do it because God would raise him from the dead. No, he stopped and he said, God can do, God can ask. And by what he stood and he says, God is able. No matter what it is, no matter what God asks for, God is able to do whatever he wants to do. You understand that? There's a difference. Sometimes we stand more on what is the promise and what we believe we want God to do. So Abraham isn't saying, I'm going to do this, but God is going to raise my son. I know he's going to raise my son. No. He's saying, I'm going to give him Isaac because God can ask for whatever he wants, and God is able to do whatever he wants. Do you understand this? It's not about doing it because you want that end result for Isaac to come back to life. He's not even thinking about Isaac coming back to life. He's thinking more of God is able. God is able to do what he wants. Rather live or die, come back to life or not. It doesn't matter. God is able to do whatever he wants because God is God. And he can ask for whatever he wants. And Abraham stands on that. And he doesn't have to seek counsel from anybody to come to this conclusion, because that, everything he believed, is in him already. It is what he stands on. It is what he stands on. And God knows this. That's why he asked for Isaac. He knows how strong that man's foundation was. You know what I mean? So Abraham comes to that conclusion. Abraham knew that he received his son from the dead. He did. He knew he received his son from the dead. In other words, from his dead body and Sarah's dead womb. Everything was dead. Abraham was dead. He was 100. Sarah was 90. Dead womb, dead. But he received the son from the dead. From dead womb, dead body, right? This, knowing that, he received from the dead. God can do anything. Do you understand what I'm saying? Abraham, he trusts God. So he said, God can do anything. I mean, I was dead, Sarah was dead, and we have a son. Now he's asking for his son. God can do whatever he wants. He can do that. He did that. He gave us a son from the dead, from our dead bodies, and our dead organs. This, in understanding and knowing that and believing that, because of course God did it for Abraham, and he experienced that, right? He can testify of it. This gave him that hope to believe. For if God can bring forth a child from dead bodies, Sarah and Abraham, right? Then he can raise his son from the dead if he wants to, if he chooses to. But he's not going to sacrifice his son because he's holding on to the fact that God is going to. Do you understand that? Sometimes we stand on the things that we think God is going to do. We don't tell God what to do. God is able to do anything, and he will do what is right. You understand? God will do what is right. And that's what he said. God is able to do anything. God is able to do anything. Not that God's going to give me my son and raise my son, but God can do anything. And if he chooses, he will, right? That he can raise his son if he wants to from the dead, because he brought him forth from the dead, He believed that God's promises would not fail. God made a promise that his promise would not come back void. His promises would not fail. Abraham believed God completely, and to this, his conclusion continued upon the power and faithfulness of God. His conclusion was God is faithful. Yeah. God is powerful, right? God's never going to fail because God is able to do anything. So he continued in this truth. He stood on this truth. So Abraham believed completely. That God would not fail. God would not fail in anything he had promised. He's not going to fail in anything he had promised. And God, believing in Abraham, remember how he said that? Yeah, God believing that Abraham would not fail in believing that God would not fail. Do you see what I just said? Abraham, I'm going to repeat, he believed that God's promises would not fail. And to this, his conclusion continued, his understanding, his reasoning, his conclusion, his end result was that he held on to the power and the faithfulness of God, because God's promises would not come back fail. He would not fail. So Abraham believed completely that God would not fail in anything he had promised. God's not going to fail. And God, remember how earlier I said when God tested Abraham, God tested Abraham, that when Abraham knew that God would raise him. Oh, where is that? He went into that. Sorry, I moved it. That I said that in this, God was saying that as Abraham believed God, God also believed in Abraham. And as Abraham loved God, God also loved Abraham. You understand that? Because Abraham proved his love, God proved his love. Abraham stood on God. God knew what he could stand on. When it came to Abraham, he knew what he could ask. It's the same thing with this too. So Abraham believed in God completely, that God would not fail in anything he promised. And because of that, God believed that Abraham would not fail in believing that God would not fail. Do you see that? God knew that Abraham would believe God would never fail. Do you see that? God knew that Abraham believed that God would not fail. You see that? God knows. God knew what Abraham believed, how he believed in God. And God knew that Abraham knew that God would not fail. God knew this, that Abraham believed that. What about us? Do you see that? Does God know that you know that he won't fail? So we live according to that. See, for us, we're so busy trying to be something, trying to stand a certain way, look a certain way, believe a certain way, that we're not allowing God to be God. See, God knows this. That's why he knows what he can do. He knows what he can ask, because that's it. That's it. But does God know completely that you know that he will never fail you? Do you believe that? That's what Jesus believed. That's what Jesus believed. So God knew this, Abraham, right? Then God justified it. He justified it. He proved it when he asked for that, and Abraham did it. See, he knew Abraham would believe. He knew it. You see what I'm saying? I was looking at this and I was thinking to myself, we don't even live near to that when it comes to God. Here we are trying to find our way in our walk with God. We can't even believe like Abraham, but we think Abraham believes because he was Abraham. No, Abraham was just like us, but he believed and trusted God completely. You know what I'm saying? Jesus did. The woman with the two mites did. The prophets of old did. Paul did. They were people just like us. And that means we can be there. They're the examples. That means we can too. But it's us who gets in the way, because Isaac is a hindrance, because we don't believe the way we should in God, that God has tested us to believe. We fail the test. In other words, going back to verse 19, says, that's why concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Let's see. From which he also received him in a figurative sense. So this is speaking of Isaac, right? Isaac and Abraham, right? That when Abraham concluded God's faithfulness, he stood on God's faithfulness, he let his son go. See that? He completely let his son go because God asked for Isaac. So he couldn't take Isaac to the altar and be hedging. He couldn't take him to the altar and start doubting and weeping and start crying, no, my son, you see, because you're not letting it go. Even though you're sacrificing it, you're not letting it go. You see this? But when he came to the conclusion about God's faithfulness, believing it, stand on it, trusting in it, he completely let his son go. That's why he could take him to the mountain. That's why he could take his son to the top of the mountain. That's why he could. Yeah, that's why he could. He looked upon Isaac. See, Abraham looked upon Isaac as already God's. This is God's. It's God's promise. It's God's will. He belongs to God. So when Abraham asked for it, and when God asked Abraham for Isaac, Abraham coming to the conclusion, God is faithful. He can do whatever he wants. He can ask for anything he wants. God, knowing Abraham believes that way when it comes to God, he looked upon his son that God had asked for, and he said, you belong to God. You belong to God. When he looked upon Isaac, he looked upon him as you are already God's. You may have been given to me, but you're God's. You are God's. You are God's. That to him, because of that, he was already sacrificed to God. You understand? He wasn't waiting till the last minute to get on the altar, right? To get on the altar and say, okay, now I'm going to give him up and I'm going to, no. He already set in his heart, he belongs to God. Isaac is God's, because God has asked for him. He had already set it in him. You understand this? He already set it in him. That when he took Isaac onto the mountain, and he asked, where's the sacrifice? God will provide his own sacrifice, okay? When he took him to the mountain, Isaac understanding his father, like Abraham understands God, right? Isaac understands Abraham. Abraham taught him about sacrifices and about God. He's the only true God. God can ask for whatever he wants, right? Isaac, understanding his father's trust in God, Isaac knew that his father would not hold anything back from God. He knew this. So Isaac considered himself already sacrificed to God. That he was already God's. Because God asked for him. That he was the one God asked for. He was God's. Abraham, knowing his father, that God asked for Isaac, in Abraham's heart, you're God's. You belong to God. So both of them, Isaac and Abraham, entered into the will of God. They both entered and considered themselves both dead. Dead, not meaning death, but meaning separated, given to God, sacrifice, given to God. They were already given to God. Yeah. Isaac was already God's sacrifice. Abraham believed it. He let Isaac become that sacrifice. He let Isaac be what God wanted him to be. Isaac became what God wanted him to be. You understand that? He wanted to, so he became the sacrifice. You understand? He considered himself the thing God wanted the most, and he became the sacrifice before God. In other words, they considered himself already dead. Both entering into the will of God. They both entered into the will of God, considered themselves both dead or separated or sacrificed. Abraham, God's will be done. In Isaac, God's will be done. That was what they believed. Abraham is saying, I believe God's will going to be done. You God's sacrifice. You the sacrifice. You're God's already. Isaac, God has asked for me. I belong to God. I am the sacrifice. God's will be done. God's will be done. They both knew this. And in God, holding back Abraham's son from slaying Isaac, both received each other back. When God stopped Abraham from slaying his son, right? From slaying his son in verse 12 of chapter 22, yeah, where he says, and he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for I now know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. You see that? So when they both fell into that place, God's will be done. Without hesitation, without doubt, without hypocrisy, without fear. God's will is being done. But both received each other back when God stopped them. They received each other back. I was thinking about that. How Abraham he loved his son so much, but God had asked, and now his son had to become that sacrifice. He had to literally look at his son as God's sacrifice. Even though he loved him, he loved God, and God has asked. So there's this peace and this joy in it, that God should love so much. Isaac, learning from his son, had learned this lesson from his father, that God only asks for the best. You always give God the best, right? And God is asking for him. He was God's best. He understood this, that God had asked for him. Both of them allowed God's will to be done. But when God stopped Abraham's hand, he justified both of them. He did. He justified both of them. They receiving each other back as if raised from the dead, because they had both let each other go to do God's will. They had to. Isaac couldn't cling to his father. He had to let his father go to being God's will. Abraham couldn't cling to Isaac. He had to let Isaac go for God's will to be done. But when God stopped their hand, it's like God raised them and brought them back together and raised them both from the dead, receiving each other as if they live again, becoming alive, because they both were willing to die to this. You understand? For when they both stood in God's will, Abraham and Isaac both stood in God's will, their souls or their nature went out of them and from this world. In other words, when Abraham let Isaac go, all the desires and all the connections in the nature as a father, as someone who loves, right? The nature of man he had to completely let it go. He had to completely let go of the nature in order to let go of his son. Do you understand that? He had to let it go in order for Isaac to become the sacrifice God wanted. He had to let go of his nature. He did. He had to let go of his nature, and his soul part, the emotion and everything. He had to let it all go. He had to let it all go. He had to. Both of them had to. Isaac did the same thing. He had to let his father go. Even though he loved his father, he understood. Abraham taught his son well. And so Isaac came to this conclusion. And in order for him to become the sacrifice that God asked for, he had to let go his father. All the emotions, all the attachment, he says, I belong to God. And he let go his whole world. Isaac was Abraham's whole world, and he let go his whole world. Isaac, the promised son, his family was his world. He had to let go of his world. They both had to let go everything inside of them to fall into the will of God, to give God what God desired. When they both stood in that, their souls or the nature went out of them. They let it go. They didn't cry. They didn't play. They didn't bleed. They didn't cry out. With joy, they gave themselves completely to God's will. They did. And this is a reflection on what Paul was talking about in Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus, that when he sacrificed his soul. He sacrificed the nature part for God's will to be. He clung to God. Abraham clung to the truth of God. Isaac clung to what his father taught him about God. They both clung to what they had with God. They let go of their nature. They didn't allow the nature to stop God's will from being done. They learned this. And so hence the nature of the soul part was sacrificed, just like with his son on the cross. When Jesus died on the cross, he sacrificed his nature, the soul part. He clung to the divine. He allowed the nature to be sacrificed. So he didn't cry out. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He didn't justify himself. He just clung to God. What he believed he had, what he thought he knew. Remember, we talked about that in the other scriptures. This is what Abraham and Isaac is doing. They're clinging to what they have with God and becoming God's will or God's desire. To do that, they had to let go of their own lives, their own desire, their own souls, their own nature, in order for both to become what God desired them to be. That's why their nature went out from them or left them. left them. Yeah. And by God stopping the sacrifice, yeah, stopping his hand, it's like he breathed new life into them. Yeah. A new life came in to them. Yeah. A world to come. They became new creations because God was faithful. And they too, both of them, were just as faithful as God. When God stopped his hand, it was like a new life was breathed into them, like they lived again. Not only does it justify their faith, their trust, their stand with God, but it also justified God's faithfulness in knowing and understanding. You get that? Knowing and understanding. That's why in verse, where are we? That's why from which he also received him in a figurative sense. They both received each other back to life in a new creation. Abraham received Isaac. Isaac received Abraham. Yeah, they both received each other back. In a figurative sense, they lived again in a new creation, in a new joy, a new peace. You understand how great that must have been to come to that? Oh, outstanding. Because they were faithful. They were faithful. Verse 20. We get into Isaac now. It says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. Now, those were his twins, right? Jacob and Esau, right? This is in reference to Genesis 27, chapter 27, right? And again in Genesis 28. He blesses Jacob twice, and we don't realize that till later on. But Isaac favored Esau. Isaac favored Esau over Jacob because he ate of his game. Because he was an outdoorsy man, and his son Esau was an outdoors man, right? He was all covered in, he was hairy, right? But he was an outdoors. He went hunting and he with the bow and stuff. It's kind of what Isaac used to do. And so he found favor because whatever he caught, Esau would bring it to his father to eat, and he spent time. So he favored Esau over Jacob. And Jacob was the mother because he was an intellectual. He stayed in the tent, right? And kind of like that. You know, he was a smart one, right? Anyway, so even though Isaac wanted to bless Esau, when later on, when Esau's eyes were leaving him and he was close to death. Jacob deceives his father, pretending to be Esau, brings him food, right? Okay. He wanted the blessing. Because his wife, Rebecca, knew that he was going to die soon. And the blessings usually come at the end, close to their death, right? Anyway, so even though Isaac wanted to bless Esau because he loved his cooking, because he was a gamer like him, right? God's intention and will was in play. It was. God's, remember the promise? Remember the promise God made through your descendants? So when he had Esau, when Isaac had Esau and Jacob, the promise, though it would be fulfilled through both, right? In different ways, the line of what God's promise, what God was bringing forth, right? In the end, his son Jesus could only come through one of them, and it was going to come through Jacob. Yeah. So even though Isaac favored Esau, God favored Jacob. So even if Jacob had to deceive, he was moved to deceive by his mother, told him to deceive the father to get that blessing, right? That blessing. God's intention was in play here. She was moved, and she made her son do it, right? And so it was in play. So even though Isaac did not know he was blessing Jacob, God did. God knew he was going to bless Jacob because God needed him to be blessed. He did. God wasn't leaving things to chance and happenstance. He knows exactly where the light is going to go. It was going to come to Jacob. Remember, through Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob going to become Israel, going to become the tribe, and then the tribe, our Lord, right? That's how it was going to become, but not through Esau. That wasn't going to happen to Esau because Esau was worldly. Yeah, he was worldly and he didn't consider God. Jacob did. Jacob did consider God, and that's why God knew what he was going to come to and where he's going to go. So in Genesis 28, 1-5, Isaac blesses Jacob. So Isaac blesses Jacob as if he's blessing Esau, okay? And he blesses Jacob according to the goodness in his heart towards Esau. I got to read this because when I read it, I was like, oh man, he just gave him everything, right? Oh, that's in Genesis 28. Oops. No, 27 over here, from verse 27, Genesis, he says, and he came near and kissed him and smelled the smell of his clothing and blessed him and said, surely the smell of my son is like the smell of the field. Because, he was a hunter, yeah, which the Lord has blessed. Therefore, may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you. Let peoples serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's son bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you. Blessed be those who bless you. So this was Isaac's blessing upon Jacob, who he thought was Esau. Okay? He thought was Esau. Because he thought it was Esau, so he blessed him accordingly. Yeah? Isaac blessed by faith. It's funny how he says by faith, right? Because it was a deception in the midst. You see the deception? Jacob had to deceive Isaac in order to receive that blessing. Yet God knew he wanted Jacob to be blessed, okay, from Isaac. So in doing that, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob. He blessed Jacob by faith because he believed, even though he questioned it. If you read that chapter, he kind of goes, are you sure? How come you sound like Jacob? So he says, come here, let me feel you. So the mother put a rug on him, right? So he feels the rug. He goes, well, you feel, could you imagine? He's feeling a rug on his skin. And he said, well, you feel like Esau. Esau. Anyway, that's pretty hairy, to believe that because you're feeling this rug, that is Esau. That is Esau. Anyway, but because of that, he believed. He believed that it was Esau. So he blessed him, even though it was a deception, right? But where does the faith come in? The faith comes in later on. Okay, the faith comes in later on. When you take a look at what he's saying, by faith, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob, and Esau concerning the things to come, and he did. But when Esau came for his blessing, he couldn't have it. Not the same one as his father, because he can't just be dishing out blessings the same way. God has ways and reasons, and he would become serving his brother, right? The older son served the younger kind of thing, right? Here, going back to the, so God's intention was to bless Jacob. It was, even if it was this roundabout deceptive way. God knew, right? So even though Isaac did not know, God did. Yeah. Isaac blesses Jacob, like I say, accepting the will of God in spite of the circumstances. In the end, he has to accept the will of God in spite of the circumstances. Because if it happened that way, it was God's intention. Even if Isaac was deceived, remember, Isaac believes in God completely, just like his father, right? So if it turned out this way, it wasn't because he was deceived. It was actually because it's God's will. Because he did show favoritism, but it was God's will to bless Jacob. So if Jacob got the blessing, it's because God wanted Jacob to have the blessing, not because he was deceived, but because it was God's will. You understand this? He believed it was God's will, or he wouldn't have been deceived. Am I making sense to you? That's why he goes on to say, right? That's why by faith, he also blesses Jacob concerning the things to come, which the older shall serve the younger. But when you get into 21, he says, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, and then you get into this place, yeah, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, which was the, like I said, this is when they usually bless their kids, when they're dying, because it's the last words, blessings, because it was the last words given by the elder of whatever tribe, right? Before their death came, because that's when the receiver listens, their final words, right? The final thing gave the people who hears or receive gives more attention and regard to it, yeah, to what they spoke to them. They listen better because they know that these are blessed. And so these are blessing them. And so they listen carefully to what is being spoken. That's why they do it before death. They don't do it prior to it, right? They do it before they die. But in this one, he says, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, so Jacob was dying, right? And he blessed his son. In this, the receiver gave more attention to and regard to what was spoken. It would have a stronger impact and impression on the mind of the person who receives it. So if God blesses you, right? If Isaac was blessing on his deathbed, blessing Jacob, it had an impact. His wife knew this, right? His wife knew this. That's why Esau, right? That's why Esau didn't take it very well. He didn't take it very well. Let me show you something. He didn't take it very well, right? So, oh, not there. So when he blessed, oh, going back, when he blessed, when he blessed, where is it? Oh, I didn't mark it. Too far. When he blessed Jacob, where is it? When Isaac blessed Jacob, right here. When Isaac blessed Jacob, Esau was livid, okay? When Esau was, oh, that's why it's up here, okay? So he started to cry out to his father, have you only one blessing? My father blessed me, me also, me. He's kind of selfish and a spoiled kid. And Esau lifted up his voice and he wept before his father because, and this is in Genesis 27, same chapter. And then he cries out to his dad, who's right there, right? Saying, why did you bless him? Don't you only have one? You cannot only have one, bless me too. And he cries and he cries and he cries. And Isaac, his father, answered and said to him, behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth and the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass when you become restless that you shall break his yoke from your neck. So this is what Esau got. He wasn't happy. He wasn't happy because it wasn't what Jacob got. He got like abundance and protection and God's hand. Esau's going to have to fight for everything, isn't he? He's going to have to fight the sword by his hand. But like I was saying earlier, how Jacob, there we go again. Jacob, sorry, my tag came up here. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob, because if you look further down in 27, right, when Esau loses hope and he blesses, Rebecca hears that Esau wants to kill Jacob for what he did, for stealing his blessing. He does. It's the same chapter. Jacob is going to escape. So Rebecca goes to Isaac and tells Isaac, Jacob needs to get married, but I do not want him to marry anybody in this area, in Canaan. Yeah, no, send him to my father's house. Send him to my father's house, to my brother Laban, and let him get a wife from there. Okay. She did this for a reason, to get him away from Esau, because Esau wants to murder his brother, right? So Jacob calls Jacob to him. He calls Jacob to him, and look at what happens in chapter 28. So Isaac called Jacob and blessed him. Do you see that? He wasn't livid with him at all for deceiving him. He didn't scold him. What he did was he turned on and blessed him, because this is faith. He believed that it was God's will. This is what it meant. He believed that it was God's will to bless Jacob. So when Rebecca said, go send him to get a wife, he calls Jacob to himself, and Isaac blesses him again. Yeah, blesses him. He says in 28, then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, you shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise and go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife from there of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may be an assembly of peoples, and give you the blessing of Abraham to you and your descendants with you, that you may inherit the land in which you are a stranger, which God gave to Abraham. Do you see that blessing? This is Isaac accepting the will of God, even if he was deceived. This is what he means. By faith. That's what it meant. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob because he believed that it was God's will. And in the end, before he sent him off to Laban, he blessed him completely, blessed him with the blessings of Abraham, that the blessing and the promise of Abraham would continue through Jacob. Isaac saw this. He believed this. That's why he got that blessing. Yeah, that he understood God's will was being done, that the promise that was made to his father Abraham was now going to go through his son Jacob. He's going to continue through his son Jacob. That's why he blessed him. That's why by faith Isaac blessed Jacob, because he believed God. And Esau concerning the things to come, of course he did. And then by faith Jacob, when he was dying, he turned around and he blessed Joseph's sons. Now remember, Joseph was in Egypt, right? Joseph was in Egypt when he was dying. He spoke these things to make that impact. Yet he would not see it come to pass. Jacob would not see anything he spoke to his sons come to pass, right? But all who knew Jacob would believe, like him, that it would come to pass because he spoke it. He blessed each of his sons. When he blessed each of his sons, he said, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worship leaning on the top of his staff. So Joseph had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Now remember, they may be Joseph's son, but their mothers were Egyptians. Yeah. And his brothers, his other brothers, because they sold him, right? His other brothers took from one another, right? They were married, intermarrying family, right? Keeping everything in. They didn't take from the land. He married because he was there. He was there that whole time. So what Isaac did, what Israel, now the time is Israel, Jacob becomes Israel. Israel is on his deathbed. Okay, he's on his deathbed. He's dying. When Joseph comes in to see him. So Joseph comes in to see him, right? Joseph comes in to see him with his two sons. What Israel does is he sits up, but he turns and he sits on his bed. It's not that he's on his pillow and he sits up. No, he literally, as if he's going to stand up, he sits on the edge of his bed. When he sits on the edge of his bed, he takes his staff to hold him, to keep him. Yeah, he takes his staff to keep him in place because he's an elderly man now. He doesn't stand up, but he leans on it. He leans on the top of his staff, leaning on the top of his staff, meaning that he literally almost got out of bed to bless these two, to bless Joseph and his sons, leaning on the top of his staff, yeah, sitting on his bed. So because he was dying, he went through all of that to bless Joseph. Israel was in bed, and Israel sat up and turned and sat on his bed. He uses the staff to hold himself up because when he saw Joseph's son, he gave praises to God and glorified him. Because why? Why? Because remember the promise? Remember the promise God made about the descendants? Like the stars. Jacob was like the sand on the sea, right? And Isaac blessed Jacob, saying, God going to work through you too. Now Jacob, who is now Israel, sees Joseph with his two sons. He had lived long enough. Israel did. He lived long enough. And to not only see, he got to see Joseph again in his old years. He got to see Joseph, and they moved to Goshen, right? Taking care of them. He got to see Joseph, but he got to see his seed as a fulfillment of the promises through Joseph. He saw two boys, Manasseh and Ephraim, and what he saw was the promises of God continuing. The promises of God was going to continue through them, through all his sons. That means Joseph too. You understand that? So Joseph wasn't without kids. Joseph had kids. So that means they all had kids, right? But Israel saw the promise of God, the descendants was going to go through all of his sons, even Joseph. So when he saw, even if these kids were half Egyptian, he saw the promises of God through them, and he glorified God. It said that, and he worshiped God by faith when he was dying, bless each of the sons of Joseph and worship. You see that, and worship? And that was him glorifying God for seeing the promise of God being fulfilled through Joseph also. Through Joseph also. This is him glorifying God. So he set up to bless them. Because the future promise was going to continue even through Joseph's boys. By faith, right? So by faith in 22, by faith Joseph when he was dying. in regards to the divine promise of God. Remember the promises of God. Now you got to assume that Israel or had told Joseph all about the promises, because what he says and what Joseph does, what he tells the people, it's like he knows the whole plan of God, right? And most likely Israel did tell Joseph, because he blesses Joseph's two boys, and he tells the two boys, right? Because he sees the promises of God. He tells the two boys, I take these two boys to be my own, as if they're my own sons. That's what he tells Joseph, that your sons are my sons, because he sees the promises flowing through them also, through all that is part of him. You understand that? So he takes these two, and not being rejected because they have Egyptian. He accepted them and said, they are mine. This is what Israel told Joseph, that Manasseh and Ephraim, they are mine. They are mine because they're part of the promise that God made. You understand that? That God made. And it's going to continue through all my sons, Joseph, and your sons and your boys. It's going to continue. So by faith, when Joseph was dying in regards to divine promises of God, right? What Israel was talking about, and he shared it with Joseph, right? Spoke to him by his father Israel. Yeah. Dying did not weaken his faith in those promises. So Joseph, even if he was in Egypt, he believed in God. He trusted, and we see that in his story, right? In Genesis, we see the story of Joseph, how he held on to God and believed in God, and God made him prosperous in Egypt, right? He held on to who God was, who he was to God and who God was to him. But when his father told him about the promise, understanding the promises, right? Even though he was dying, it didn't weaken his faith and his trust in those promises. Yeah, in those promises. So when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel. Remember, out of Egypt, the departure of the children of Israel out of Egypt, right? Because Joseph put it into their thoughts by speaking. Remember that when they're ready to die, they speak all these words so everybody hears, right? Joseph put it into their thoughts by speaking of it, right? By speaking of it, and to bring not only comfort, because they were mourning and grieving he was about to die, but to bring comfort, saying God is going to take you guys out of this land one day. For Joseph was assured of it. That's how strong his faith was in God too. He was so assured of it. He knew it so deeply. He foresaw it. He knew it. He foresaw it, and firmly believed that they would be greatly afflicted after his death. He knew, because he knew once he died, he was the only thing keeping the new Pharaoh, from hurting his people. Because once Joseph died, the new Pharaoh says, I have nothing to do with Joseph, and I don't know these people. I have nothing to do with Joseph. And he knew they were going to be afflicted after his death. He believed that God would look upon them, look in, right? And one day he would deliver them and bring them out of Egypt. He believed all of this. That was their only way out of Egypt, through God's hand. Joseph believed this. He believed that God would bring them into the land of promise, just like his father believed, just like his father before him, just like Abraham believed that they were going to be in the land of promise, the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, Jacob, his father. You know what I mean? He believed it. And of this shows the strength of his faith. He stood on it. He believed it, and that it was about things not even yet seen. He was telling them, one day God's going to come and visit you folks. Yeah, you guys are going to be afflicted. And one day God's going to come visit you folks, and he's going to deliver you folks. So it says, so he gave instructions concerning his bones. His command was so strict that he made them make an oath. He took an oath from his brothers, to fulfill it. And it took 400 years, right, for them to finally leave, but they fulfilled that oath. So when they left Egypt, they took the bones of Joseph with them. You read about that in Genesis chapter 50, right? The death of Joseph, when he makes them promise. Joseph believed so strongly that he refused to be buried like the Egyptians. The Egyptians would bury them in tombs and pyramids and, right, great things. He refused to be buried like the Egyptians. He wanted to be in the promises of God. He wanted to stay in the promises of God. In other words, so even after death, he still wanted to be a part of the promise. That's why he didn't want to die or be buried in Egypt. He wanted to go where the promise took him, where the promise would take all God's people. He wanted to be a part of the promise. He wanted to stay a part of the promise. So he humbled himself, right? Refusing to be honored, refusing to be honored, yeah, refusing to be honored for the great things he had done for Egypt. He did. He was outstanding for Pharaoh, wasn't he? The Pharaoh was acknowledging him all over the place, right? But he refused to take any acknowledgement, yeah? But he gave himself to his brethren. When he died, he gave himself to his brethren, believing that as they, yeah, received the promises, he would be a partaker of it with them. He would be. So he refused to be acknowledged, yeah? Knowing that dying in the promises of God was better than living as a king. He didn't want his bones to be worshipped. He didn't want to die in Egypt and amongst other pharaohs and great men of Egypt. He humbled himself to the point that he wanted to be with God. Where God took his people is where he wanted to be. That's where he wanted to be. This is him humbling himself and refusing what he was worthy of in Egypt. He was worthy of praise and glory. He was worthy to be honored as a king. He was worthy to be honored as a great man of Egypt, but he refused it all because he'd rather be with God's people when they enter the promise. He wanted to lay with his fathers, in the same promise that they believed in. He wanted to be in the same promise that his fathers believed before him believed. He didn't want to separate. He wanted to be. Hence the children of faith, right? They believe. The children of faith, they believe. So by faith, Joseph, when he was dying, he made mention of his departure to the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. And he was going to be with them. That's how far, that's what he saw. That was his hope, that he would be in the promise of God. He wanted to be in the promises of God. I'm going to stop at that verse only because, right, then he goes into Moses. I don't want to mix the two up. Okay, I don't want to mix the two up. So when we go back and let's reflect a little bit, right, because it was short. Yeah, reflect a little bit. When you take a look at what God is saying in this, what I should say Paul is saying, God is saying through Paul, he's reminding us on what we stand on. The faith of Abraham, right, was being tested. Can we endure such a testing from God? See, the deal is God is only testing what he knows is there. He knows you believe, he knows you trust, he knows how you stand. He's going to test you accordingly. But when you profess and when you vow and when you do these things, that's going to be tried too, because he also knows that's not part of this. Sometimes we have to learn what we do not have. You understand that? Sometimes we have to see what God sees, you know? In this, he was willing, he offered up Isaac. He was willing to give up everything for what he has with God. He had to literally die to self to give up Isaac. And Isaac literally had to die to self to become the sacrifice. And yet when God stayed his hand and they both were willing to be what God wanted them to be, they were renewed in their spirit. You know, they were rejuvenated and they lived again and they rejoiced. Yeah. And the promise would continue. This is why God considered him faithful. The conclusion that Abraham comes to about God is based on that foundation. And just like us, we may question, we may say, but our conclusions, our reasoning should always come from where we stand, not where we do not stand or where we're trying to stand, but where we stand. Where we stand. This is difficult because sometimes we try to do things based on what we're trying to do or trying to become. What we're trying to do and trying to become. So we don't come to any real conclusions about things, but we have to learn to stand, because this is where the testing is. Can you stand because of who you believe God is? This is what Jesus teaches us. You know what I'm saying? This is what Jesus teaches us, right? And so through his life, that his stand in God was greater, yeah, than his own life. than his own life. Jacob, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob. And even though Isaac was deceived, he knew it was God's will. So he blessed him again because it was God's will. He knew it. He knew it. Or it wouldn't have happened that way. You see how he believed? He believed in God so much, Isaac. He believed in God so much that things don't happen by chance. Nothing happens by chance. Nothing. If it happened and turned out this way, it's because it was God's desire. It was. And it overrode his own desire. It did. Because he wanted to bless Esau, because he favored Esau. But it was God's desire to bless Jacob. And so he blessed Jacob, and then he blessed Jacob again before he sent him off to Laban. And Israel, when we look at that by faith, Jacob, who was Israel by faith, when Israel saw the sons of Joseph, well, he got to see his son, and that broke him, and they moved to Goshen. But when he saw Joseph's sons for the first time, he glorified God and he thanked God that the promise continues even through the sons of Joseph, because it wasn't about being pure Hebrew. They were half Egyptian, yet he looked upon them and he saw the promise continue. And he said, they will be like my sons. They're mine. They're mine. They are going to be part of the promise. Yeah. And that's what it was. He believed it. Joseph understanding what was going to happen, understanding what God can do, because he stood on God too, man. Understanding what God can do and would do, refused to lay his body anywhere but in the promise of God, only in the promise of God. So he would be laid with his fathers. Yeah, because that's where everybody was, right? In Canaan. They were all buried in Canaan. And so he wanted to be where his fathers were buried. So when we take a look at everything that God is saying, he shows us the faith of those who came before, the patriarchs, who laid the foundation of what it looks like, what it is to stand, what it is to have this kind of faith, because it is the substance of your relationship with God. It is the proof, right? So the substance is that foundation. Faith is everything you put in there. Everything you put in there. How you stand is proof, is evidence what's there. You understand? That's the evidence, because how you stand is going to take you to where you know you're going to be. You're going into a kingdom. You're not trying to get to a kingdom. You're standing on where you know you're going. That's your hope. Yeah, there. Even though you don't see it, it's coming. Yeah. So there, the patriarchs taught us to stand, all of them, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. How we stand is proof of our foundation. It is the evidence. Like in verse 1, faith is the substance. The substance of the things hoped for, the evidence of the things not seen. It is the foundation of our faith. Having a deeper relationship with God, it is the proof of what we stand on. You understand this? It is the proof of what we stand on. The way we stand is proof of what we stand on. So in that, we're going to stop right here. And then Friday, we're going to continue about Moses. We're going to stop from 23 to 29. We're going to stop there. Okay. Let me turn this on.